back. It's been a while since we did a Learning to Look. Took a break in August and September, and we're back in October. We had done a coffee with curators, but pretty much needed to take some time off after a whole bunch of sessions in May and June and July and August. So anyway, we're back. We want to thank the Patchogue Arts Council and the Patchogue Medford Library for hosting our talk today. And today's talk is supposedly about photorealism, which is going to play a very big part in this talk, but it's going to be about more than just photorealism. And we want to think about what happened to make photorealism. That's going to be part of what we talk about here today. So here we go, photorealism. And change slide. Let's see. There we go. It likes to hit 2. So photorealism is a movement which gained popularity in the late 1960s and not early 1970s, but early 1970s. And what we're looking at here is a photorealist work from one of our local community. Malcolm Morley, who passed away just a couple of years ago, lived in Bellport. And since the mid-1960s, he was an artist of renown and spent a period of that time being a photorealist. So what we want to think about is, what is realism, and how did, since this is photorealism, how did photography affect realism? These are a couple of the topics we're going to cover today. Right? Photorealism was coined by a gallerist named Louis Mizell in 1969. He started talking about this as a concept, right? And it first appeared in print as a term in 1970 for an exhibition at the Whitney called 22 Realists. Back in those days, it was important to try to coin terms, to create movements, create a lot of buzz around a particular concept. So a lot of gallerists, a lot of art writers were always vying for, for priority in creating a term that would lead a movement. So Louis Mizell, he defined photorealism in 1972, right? He said photorealists use the camera and photograph to gather information, right? The photorealist uses mechanical or semi-mechanical means to transfer information to the canvas, right? Mechanical means might be a projector, right? The photorealist must then have the technical ability to make the finished work appear photographic. This is a work by Chuck Close. Phil is Philip Glass, and Chuck Close did a lot of portraits. We're going to see a bunch of them a little bit later, of famous friends of his. Also, Louis Mizell went on to say, the artist must have exhibited work as a photorealist by 1972 to be officially a member of the original group. And that the artist must have devoted at least 5 years to the development and exhibition of photorealist work. So by 1972, right, this idea of photorealism was starting to catch on, and the idea of who are the original members of this loose affiliation of artists was important. So Louis Mizell set out the ground rules for this. Right, and we'll look at some of the artists who then were participants in the early photorealist movement. But what we want to do is we want to think about this idea of realism, how realism came, what does it mean to be realist, to be a realist work of art, and then we want to think about how photography added to that picture. So let us see. What is realism? How did photography affect realism? slide up here twice. I'm sorry. Again, another work from Malcolm Morley in 1966. Right? But now we want to examine that idea of realism. Okay, realism is defined as the effect of a work that is as true to life as the technology of the day is able to produce, right? So we have realist works going all the way back to the cave paintings in La Chaux, right? These animals are meant to be vibrant and full of life and painted with um, a a sense of being alive, right? So they're painted directly on a cave wall. The walls are lumpy. They tended to use a lot of natural pigments, and the actual contours of the walls to make these first types of realist paintings. They also had to get into some very tight spots to make these, and they would grind natural pigments, stones, and vegetable matter up into animal lard and use that as paint. So a little bit later in time, we see a move away from realism to a concept of abstraction, right? Abstraction would be then the purposeful distortion of imagery. So here we see a goat, an ibex specifically. We see a couple of tame dogs, and on top we have some wading birds. None of these are represented as realistically as the work of the Paleolithic period. Now, there's you could say that the artist didn't have the ability, but that's not really the case, right? The choice to be realist or abstract is one that is either a cultural phenomenon or a personal phenomenon. And in this period of time, the Neolithic, this is the time when agriculture is catching on. It's just prior to the beginning of writing. A lot of new types of abstract thought are entering into culture, and the work is represented is very abstract. Okay. Okay, some figures from the Cycladic Islands. We can see that the human figure is simplified down into an abstraction as well too. And now we're going to examine some figures and watch the movement from abstraction to realism span a couple of millennia. Right. So in Egypt, around the same time as the Cycladic Isles, we see a form of realism that is more an ideal than an actual realism, and that's carried out again into the height of the Greek civilization. Right. The Egyptians are painted in a very or sculpted in a very kind of staid fashion, and the details are kind of eliminated off of most of the body except their faces, but their faces are idealized. And in Polykletos's work, the Dorophoros, right, he actually created this work, and we're looking at a marble a Roman copy of the original Greek, which has been lost. Polykletos made this sculpture for a specific purpose. He wanted to present what he considered was the ideal man, right? And what he did was he measured all sorts of, good-looking guys and figured out what was the average proportion for everything. And then he sculpted this figure based on all of the numbers that he created from that. So where it looks very realistic, it doesn't represent any individual. Rather, it represents the ideal of an individual. Now, as we move to the Roman Empire, we can see again the face, the figure has a high level of realism, but this is an emperor, and this emperor did not want to be just seen in his common guise, so he's idealized in this work. So a sculpture and a painting from Rome. The sculpture especially is now not the ideal emperor who is part god, but just a regular person. And the Romans were very fond of this extreme realism, of making these figures warts and all. Every single wrinkle needed to be put in here because those wrinkles were actually seen as badges of, you know, of respect, that this person had lived a long life and had wisdom. So they did not want to hide any of the life, so they created extremely realistic sculpture and paintings as well too, as we see of this woman in the blue mantle. So the Romans were very interested in making things that were as realistic as possible. Right? And here's one of my favorites. This isn't created in Rome, but it's created in Egypt under the Roman Empire. And it's, you know, these were put on caskets, the likeness of the figure for a person who couldn't afford a mummy, you know, couldn't afford the sarcophagus. They would just get a painting. But what I've always liked about this one is that well, you'll have to figure that out for yourself. Okay. Okay. The Romans also tried to create a sense of realistic space and depth, and they, you know, they were problem solvers in ways that you might not have thought. So a lot of the Roman homes were built into the sides of hills. You know, remember the seven hills of Rome, right? And there was a reason for that, because by being built into the hill, they were essentially naturally air conditioned from the hot summers of Rome. Right, but now you're living in this place where half of your, you know, only one side of your space looks out into the world, and the rest of it is buried in a mountain, right, or a hill. And so, in order not to feel claustrophobic, the Romans started making these types of paintings, which were painted right into their living rooms to give them the sense of, well, here we can look out onto the hillside and up to the temple of Zeus, or whoever that temple belonged to back over there, right? So they created this illusion of real space. Now, as we move into the Middle Ages, that idea of creating realistic illusions is supplanted by creating a spiritual feeling in the work. So space is collapsed into a more flatter depth, and light is removed and replaced with gold, which is meant to indicate spirituality. This is Empress Theodora, by the way. She's one of my favorite characters from the Byzantine Empire. She was the wife of Emperor Justinian, and who so respected her that he made her co-emperor. And then he passed away before she did, till she became the sole ruler of the Byzantine Roman Empire. During her time, she advocated for women's rights. So here she is in a very shallow space, holding onto the chalice, because she's going to walk through this curtain and celebrate Mass. right? So we're in this period of the medieval period where there is like gold is symbolic of spiritual light. So it infuses these works. And in these three works, we see a transition from early 1200s to the early 1300s, a reawakening of a sense of realism. And we look to Giotto as being the leader of that movement, the work on the third work, the one on the right, where now we start to see a figure that has an actual body, right? You can see and sense her body under her garments, right? So um, artists in the beginning of the 1300s were starting to wake up to a new sense of realism. And that carried through into the 1400s and really started, artists were really showing off their ability to create realistic works using two different techniques. Perspective, which was invented in Italy, and oil paint, which was perfected in Flanders, right? The perspective gave us an illusion of the space as being real, that we can stand in front of it and feel like we can enter into it. The Romans just kind of did it by feel, but now the space is organized, and the um, the Flemish painters starting to work with oil paints were able to work in a much more precise manner. Fresco was kind of hard to you had to work fast and rapidly, but oil paint you can go over and over again with its long drying time. And the artists of the Northern Renaissance first, and then the Southern Renaissance developed this great skill in creating lifelike textures. You could see them in all of the clothing, in the other the other parts of the room as well, the floor. Everything is got like a texture that we're bordering on photorealism, even though there isn't photography yet. There is one thing, however, that is starting to be created at this time that will lead us to photography, right? And I'll talk about that in just a moment. What we see as we go from the 14th through the 15th and into the 1600s, we see a sense of more and more realistic, the ability to create heightened realism, right? And of course, it's all about the technology that's at hand. The use of oil paint has been really perfected now, and another tool is starting to come into use. We'll see it in a moment. Before that, though, Caravaggio is considered the leader of this new type of movement that we call the Baroque, and there were lots of followers of him. One of them was the father of Artemisia Gentileschi, and as a woman, she could really only learn to paint because through a family member, because at that time you would have gone off to work in some other person's studio, right? So Artemisia's father was a follower of Caravaggio, and then she became one as well too in style, right? Her themes are all about heroic women, though, so it's a different kind of story that we get. We in both of these, we also see this sense of a new spatial awareness that brings the action of a work right to our feet, right? So we get drawn right into these works. Well, I think now, well, we're almost there. A couple more paintings to show how skillful the artists of the Baroque period were getting with their ability to create realism, and Vermeer, again, working to create all sorts of interesting textures. And Rachel Rush is creating these still lifes with lots of floral items in them. Right? So here we go. Finally, we worked our way through all of those improvements in in realism. But one of the tools that was being developed over that time was the camera obscura, which literally means dark chamber. And although it was perfected during the Renaissance, what I have found out is that the first camera obscuras are mentioned in Islamic lands going back to the 11th century, hundreds of years before the Renaissance. And really, it's the Islamic countries that form the link and maintain the knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans and deliver that to the people of the Renaissance. Right. So the first camera obscuras were developed, but since the Islamic people were not creating representational art, they did not use this as a tool for making art. Well, a camera obscura essentially is a pinhole in a wall that lets light come in. Right? And the light that comes in is of whatever is in front of that hole, and it passes right through, and it projects it on the rear wall, as you can see, in reverse and upside down. So an artist then could copy whatever that image is that comes through the pinhole. Well, you know, if you have a room with a pinhole in it, the view is never going to change. So the first thing that had to happen was to make the camera obscura portable. And we see that on the sleds, and that's the way artists used them during the Renaissance. Now, as time went on, that little pinhole through the physics of optics, lenses were created that could focus and sharpen that image, right? And the box was made more portable, so you didn't have to go inside it anymore. And you can see in this illustration, the light coming from outside is focused on through the lens and projected onto the back plate, and then the artist is copying or rendering what he sees through the glass. Now, this is all a mechanical process, right? And photography was still waiting to be born. What photography needed was some way of recording that image on that back plate that wasn't by mechanical means. And the chemistry developed to do that around the same time, right? So in the late 1700s, the first photosensitive chemicals were discovered. And at first they were just used like you could just lie something down on top of a surface that was treated with the chemicals, shine a light on it for a while, and wherever the light didn't hit the chemicals would stay white, right? And so that was in the 1700s. So what had to happen was the physics of the optics that were used in the camera obscura and the lenses need to be connected to the chemistry that was being developed. And a couple of different people, including Louis Daguerre, developed processes where chemicals were brushed onto a metal plate that was then sensitized by the light, and an image could be created. And that is the birth of modern photography. One of the early works and techniques was created by Daguerre, and he was full of himself enough that he called the process a daguerreotype. Right? The Boulevard du Temple from 1839 has it's almost like there's no one living in this city. It's Paris, and there's nobody living in it. There should be bustling streets. But the problem is, at this point, the amount of time it takes to sensitize that plate is so long that people have just walked on, and their images aren't recorded. If you look to the lower left, you can see two figures who were standing still. One is actually kneeling down, and the other has his leg lifted because he's getting his shoe shined. So they stayed still long enough for their image to appear, whereas no one else did. So now we have this new science, this new technology of photography. And for years, artists have been perfecting and honing their skill at creating the most realistic images, and then comes this mechanical means that is able to produce an image. Some people saw this as being more realistic, more true to life than anything that a painter could make. Well, painters would usually, you know, edit a scene, right? So they chose what would make it into their painting. In this case, the photograph or the daguerreotype recorded everything just as it was. So it was given like a special place in the idea of realism, right? That these things were more real than any object that could be created by an artist. So around that time, artists were trying to think about what is their next move? How do they respond to the idea of this new form? No one considered it an art form. It was just a means of reproduction reality at that point. And during that time, a new movement arose, which has been called realism. And Gustave Courbet was an early practitioner of this new movement, realism. Right now, when you look at this work, it's a grainy photograph. I'm sorry, this work was destroyed in 1945 in World War II, right? But it's an important one, so we hold on to this image. Courbet created a scene that is very realistic, and if you kind of look at the light, it could also feel like the light, like the light is being almost uh, is not natural. It's artificial light being pushed, to light the bodies with the sharpness of the shadows on their bodies, right? But so he could have been using photographic techniques already when he made this. But the term realism doesn't have to do with the photographic reality as much as it has to do with the social issues that were being uh, uh, discussed during these works. So here we have an artist who decided to make paintings of the lower underclass people. And, people bought paintings that had people with money bought paintings, and they didn't really want this type of work. And people like Courbet and Dickens created artworks. Dickens, the writer, of course, of the Christmas Carol, started making stories that described the plights of the lower classes. Well, so what is the game then that the painters are going to play? And here we see one of them. Like the movement is Impressionism, and the artists were like they were going to be the camera lens themselves. They were going to capture the image as if it was fresh and untainted, not brought back to the studio and cleaned up, but just exactly how they saw it. So Renoir and Manet and Monet and others created paintings that had a fleeting feel, as if you were seeing something in a flash of light, and then it was gone, right? So he just captures this energy and the brilliance and the flecking light throughout this work, and it's as if the eye is just a dumb camera lens. That was the goal of the Impressionists. Well, after the Impressionists, artists started to think, well, we wanted to communicate something more deep through our painting technique. And we move into a period called Neo-Impressionism, of course, with Vincent van Gogh and some others, where the type of abstraction, we're back to abstraction again, is part of the message of the work. So from 1889 through the next couple of decades, we see artists becoming more and more abstract with their work, right? And then ultimately we reach a point much earlier than this, but we reach a point of pure non-representational work, right? with artists like Kandinsky around circa 1915 and 20. And at that point, there was a back and forth after World War I with representation and abstraction. As we reach the end of World War II, we see a group of abstract expressionists create works that are pure non-representation, right? And this is the big thing in the 1950s and moving forward. Artists are going to have to figure out how to work in a milieu where these are the types of work that everyone wants to see. So we start seeing artists who use abstract expressionist techniques and start to put in representational imagery again, as Larry Rivers, George Washington crossing the Delaware, Andy Warhol. If you see in the 1960s, he was a graphic designer, and you can see he's trying to capture that energy of abstract expressionism and combine it with graphic design. And in the painting 210 Coca-Cola bottles, he's painting each one of these bottles individually and trying to make it feel like an abstract expressionist overall painting. Right? Roy Lichtenstein then is again coming out of abstract expressionism, and his work becomes flatter and sharper, but he's interested in action, right? Just like the action paintings. So in these cartoon images, we see all sorts of action taking place. And then that action eventually feeds into his most famous series of work where he's using a comic strip mentality to make these paintings. And then his reference to action painting is overt in 1965, right? Okay, so this is the abstract expressionist movement morphing into what we now know as pop art, right? In the early 1960s, right? A move from abstraction to a new kind of realism, one that is more mechanical and kind of banal in its messaging. At the same time, another group of artists were responding to abstract expressionism by making canvases that became less and less active, more and more logical, right? So we have Frank Stella's Gedi's Tomb in 1959, right, in which he very carefully painted the black over the canvas, just leaving a little bit of white exposed. So it's like hand ruled on this point. And the canvas structure dictates the logic of the internal painting. Now, this idea of this honing down on the communication within a painting is going to lead us to a concept called minimalism. And minimalism was mostly promoted by sculptors. There were some painters involved in it as well, too. But the idea was to take an object down to its most basic essence, where we have total agreement on what we see, right? So we look at Carl Andres Herman, it's just a piece of cedar. We actually have one of these in the Art Council. It's a knockoff. And Tony Smith just gives us a solid cube of steel. Right? Well, there is a certain relationship between minimalism and its paring down of the message and pop art. And we see that here, right? The idea of repetition, monotony, the idea of making statements that are as succinct as possible with no room for misinterpretation, right? So two movements that are both dominating the early to mid 1960s. This is just before the development of photorealism, right? And a couple of other artists working in the minimalist, Dan Flavin uses neon, and in the pop vein, we have Edward Ruscha, who is giving us a sense of these places. And these are like now all of the things that are going to the very first making of photorealist works. Right? One of the first artists we recognize as a photorealist is Richard Estes. And his work earlier had been more expressionistic, painterly realism, and he honed it down to make these images that were uh, bright and shiny, like photorealism, and very matter of fact, like bright and shiny, like pop. You know, the images are kind of pop oriented in his work at first, and but they are as basic as a statement as he could make. Right. So this is the painting that he considers himself as his first photorealist painting. And when you look at Richard Estes' works through the 1960s and even beyond, we're going to see a couple of themes. There's a lot of reflectivity, right? There's reflections and shininess are the things that he presents. All of his works are really cityscapes, you know, but he cleans up the city a little bit. He doesn't, you know, he wants to really celebrate the city as much as anything else. So he cleans up his imagery and presents this very bright, shiny, matter-of-fact technique of painting. Now, photorealists were united not in subject, but in technique. So here we have his double self-portrait from 1976. I had to look hard at this to find this second self-portrait, right? You see the first one by the crossing of the window, but if you look further down into that, you can see another reflection of him all the way down over here, right? So Richard Estes' works are all about these reflections, the shininess, the cleaning up of the city, and the presentation of it as almost like an ideal more than a realistic image. His play on reflections is something that has gone back a very long time. And we can see that if we go back to look at the Arnolfini portrait, that the artist put himself all the way back here in this mirror. And if you look into the enlargement of the mirror, you can see the backs of the two principals, the Arnolfini couple, and beyond them you can see the artist himself. So he's painting his own reflection. This painting is only about 35 inches tall, and so if you look at that little mirror, it's probably only about 6 inches, and the space that he paints himself into can't be more than 1.5 inches in size. And you know, so he's showing off his skill and adding himself into the work. So reflections were very important to Richard Estes as a photorealist, and they play out into the work of another photorealist from that period, Vijaya Clemens, right? And Vijaya Clemens is most noted for making works that about natural phenomena. So here we're seeing the expanse of water. She constantly came back to this as a subject, right? The openness, the expansiveness of the water, but also of the idea that that water is presented almost in a minimal fashion, right? It's just so matter of fact, and it's devoid of all value. It's just presented as a little slab of reality. So she painted these paintings of water, and prior to that, she had been doing these little realist paintings and moved from there into painting these water paintings and other scenes from nature. Oh, but before that, another artist who was influential on Clemens was Leonardo da Vinci, who also painted water as he studied its turbulence, and Albrecht Dürer, who was studying natural landscapes. And here you see another work, the desert. Right? So the water, the desert, they end up almost being equal in their presentation. One is very dry, of course, and the other is wet, but each one of them is an overall expanse, right? So we have oceans of desert and oceans of water. And then she started later on. She left the graphite behind and started making paintings, and the night sky became this other concept that she worked in. So all of these things are seen to be overall paintings, right? That stretch from end to end without a sense of composition, right? That's the way Vijaya Clemens was working. And there was somebody who had, we had seen abstract expressionists do that before, but the idea of constellations goes all the way back to Juan Miró, who this was called constellations, and he was making overall type paintings in the 1940s. She also painted other natural phenomena, and this is a spider web that she's painted, that she photographed at night, so it's got that very grainy feeling to it. It doesn't have that high resolution because she's actually capturing the sensation of looking at this spider web at night. She also did some sculpture, and this was earlier in her career, and it was around the same time that Andy Warhol was making uh, Brillo boxes. Now, another abstract expressionist, photorealist, and one of the earlier practitioners was Audrey Flack. And she began as an abstract expressionist in the 1950s and evolved into making more succinct messages that could only be made by representation, right? Abstract expressionism gives you a general experience, but if you want to make a specific statement, you need to move towards our narrative. And she started working from photographs, a famous photograph in this case of the Kennedy motorcade in 1964, taken just a few minutes before his assassination. By the early 1970s, she had started using projectors and taking photographs and projecting them and working from those, which is allowed in photorealist techniques. And here we see an original work from the Baroque, the late Spanish Baroque, and Audrey Flack's version of the Weeping Madonna. She got into doing some very colorful, intensely, intensely colorful imagery, and really honing her skill through a few different works during the early 70s. And then she started moving towards giving these works more specific meanings like she had in her earlier works, right? So here we're looking at like a woman's dressing table, and we're seeing all of the glitzy shininess of it. But this is going to give way in a year or two to a different type of painting called the Vanitas, in which it's also a still life, but now the still life includes the idea of a image of death, right? So the skull is in there to remind us that no matter how glitzy everything is, that eventually whatever our life is, it's going to come to an end, right? So Audrey Flack in the middle to late 70s worked on a series of still lifes that she, were all vanitas. You see the hourglass, uh, dropping its sand, and we see the fruit, which is a symbol of youth, but then we also see the time running out, the candle running out, the images of time and of youthful beauty, youthful vigor, and the awareness that eventually that will come to an end. So she made some of these paintings. Now, we've looked at three different photorealists. Each one had a different idea of what they wanted to express. The only thing they had in common was their use of the same techniques, right? So subject matter varies greatly, just technique is the same in the photorealists. This is the Wheel of Fortune. Sorry, I didn't note this one. Again, it's the Vanitas, 1977. And again, the whole accumulation of objects that show the passage of time, the the attempt to retain youth, and the eventual inability to remain young and eventually to pass away. There's a couple of mirrors in here, and she was again playing that mirror game, right? And so obviously this is a mirror that's reflecting this side over here, and this mirror is reflecting above, but then she includes a crystal ball in this one, which is actually a convex mirror, and she's showing over here an image of herself, right, taking the picture that would end up being the material used to make this Wheel of Fortune painting. Well, I have another photorealist, I believe, is up next, a very interesting character, Chuck Close, and we might as well look at him full on right now in his self-portrait from 1968. Right, Chuck Close was a portraitist. All of his works were of human faces. He has a very interesting reason why he chose to make these large paintings of human faces. I'm assuming this one's Richard Serra, another one of his friends from that era. If you look at these faces, right, he used a camera in a very interesting way. He used a large body camera with a very big negative, and he would put that camera right up like just a few inches away from the person's face and get like sharp focus around the eyes, but then the depth of field would cause other parts of it to become less focused. And in his works, it becomes a play of sharp focus and a little bit of blurriness. Now, the reason why he started making these works was he has a disability that is one that many people aren't aware of. It's called aphasia, and he had the inability to recognize somebody's face. Right? If he were to look at you and turn around and turn back and somebody else was standing in your place, he wouldn't know that you had changed places, right? He could not recognize people's faces. So in order to try to understand the faces of his friends and to hold them in his memory, he started making these paintings, and you saw how big they were, right? He turned these faces into like studies that became, in a sense, abstractions of the human face on scale and on detail, and he was able to like really study the faces of the people that he knew. This one is Philip Glass, a composer from a friend of his who's still active. By the way, so far all of these artists were born in the 1930s. Chuck Close was born in 1940, and all of them are still alive, if not active. So he eventually started using color, right, in his work, and I just be careful. This one's gonna shock you a little bit. Okay, so you can see the extreme detail that he used in making this, and you can also see that by the time he reaches the tip of the nose, it's not as sharp a focus as the eyes are. So these paintings are big. They're like 108 inches tall, and he worked that size for a long time. For decades, he made these enormous paintings. Here's another self-portrait. He's a little bit older now, some 8 or 9 years older. And while he always made portraits of other people, he has a whole series of self-portraits as well. Probably the only other person who has spent as much time making self-portraits was Rembrandt. And Rembrandt made paintings of himself throughout his life. And what I decided to do, I could have shown you other people that he painted, but I decided let's just look at the self-portraits because you get the idea of his style. But I really do want to show you what happened to his technique. over the years. Like some artists were content to make photorealistic works for the remainder of their career, but Chuck Close had a different plan, right? And the evolution of his work is really fascinating. So I want to share that with you, right? So he started looking into the idea of pixelation, and not just like um, how how much detail can a camera have, but how much can it lose as well, right? And how much can it lose and still hold on to the image? And that's what pixelation is about. So he started making these works um, in the late 70s, and here's a self-portrait from the late 70s. And then, of course, he started using color in these pixelated images. And we're going to go through these relatively quickly. By the 90s, instead of just using little blobs of color, those little those little pixelated areas ended up becoming small compositions of their own. Right, so we'll look at some of these. And he's, he's reached a style that he's pretty much going to stay in the late 90s, and he might have even been doing this in the late 80s. But what's happening is he's getting older as you look at these. So this is not a painting, but a daguerreotype again. And he's explored photography and other techniques as well during this period, throughout his career as well. And the last works that I was able to get from him are around 2012 and 2013. He's now 80 years old, but when you see all of these amazing paintings that he's made, and the self-portraits are just a small part of his body of work, and the paintings are also, even though most of them are very large, they represent only one element in his work. He was still doing some works that were more realistic, and he was making photographs in different ways as well too. So, but what truly is amazing about Chuck Close, as we look at his work in 2012, is that some 24 years before he made this painting, he had a stroke. And he 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 lost the ability to paint. Well, he lost the ability to move most of his body. He has no uh, ability to stand, and he has limited ability to move his upper arms. The stroke affected him in his upper spinal cord, and his lower body doesn't move anymore. And so since that point, at that point, actually, he was unable to paint. And it took him about 3 years of physical therapy to relearn how to paint and use his body enough. And then when he did, he came back to painting, and it looked pretty much the same as it did before. So we looked at a lot of paintings that he made after he had this stroke. And because it was 24 years of painting that we saw in that. Really amazing. This also shows a little bit of the technique that he developed before his stroke. And what he would do is he'd make these underpaintings where he would build up these more blockish types of areas of color, and then he would go over those with those little design shapes on top of them to create these works. Really fascinating guy. I hadn't followed him in the last few years, and it seems like I'm not able to find any work that he's made after 2013. But he is, really made some amazing work, and through a severe disability. There are pictures of him. He had a lift made that would fit his wheelchair, so he could lift himself up and work on the upper regions of his painting. So I have just a detail of his work on one painting here as it evolved. right? And a close-up of his eye and what it looks like. So it's very interesting. As you back away from these paintings, they become, they regain the focus that is lost when you're close to them. And what he's doing, he's playing between the idea of realism and abstraction, right? He's gone from photorealism, but realism and abstraction, right? Another artist who dealt with that line between realism and abstraction was Gerhard Richter. He's a German artist who began his career in uh, East Germany. And of course, the only kind of art anybody could make in East Germany was realism. There were strict rules about what type of art could be made in a communist country. But then he left East Germany. He snuck himself out into West Germany, and he started to see what other artists were doing, and his work started to change. This is in that process of change that we're seeing here. What he ended up doing was taking the idea of a photographic image in actually painting a distortion of a distortion that was created through the photograph. So instead of trying to create super realism, he tried to create distortion, but it was still a photographic reality. Right, so he was working in this kind of gray area between realism and abstraction. And then a little bit, he tried a few different things in his career, and a little bit later, he came back to photography. But when he came back to photography, he did this really unusual thing, and he would photograph small portions of his abstract paintings, and then he would blow them up, right? So he would have a photograph of maybe a 4-inch section of painting or a 6-inch section of an earlier painting, and he would take that and enlarge that into its own artwork. So this is a photographic reality that we're looking at, but it's a photographic reality of an abstraction. In the last few minutes, I just wanted to show you some people who wouldn't have been photorealists because they made sculpture, right? Dwayne Hansen, he was around at the same time as all of the early photorealists, and his work sometimes is called hyperrealism or superrealism because he's not trying to create a photographic reality because he's making a sculpture. But these pieces that he made were so realistic that when you were in the room with them, it was kind of funny. I went to see these at OK Harris when in the 1970s, and you had to wait for the people to move to see who was the sculpture and who was the live person, right? So Queenie is the cleaning woman, and she's the sculpture here. The other two women are examining her gear. Another artist who worked in super realist sculpture is Ron Muic, who's a younger artist who's active right now. And by younger, he's in his 60s now, right? But compared to me, he's a year younger than me, right? And he started making these extremely realistic figures, but he would always alter the scale of these figures. And Jeff Coons, who again is dealing with reality and abstraction, here is taking the idea of a very kitschy item, a balloon animals, and turning them into large scales metal sculptures. And now when he does these, all of the other artists, they might have worked with other people, but they were essentially hands-on artists. Jeff Koons is more of a conceptualist, so he had a crew of people who would work on these. And actually, I have a friend who worked on not one of these, but the Liberty Bell that he made. And the idea was that they had to be made to the highest of specifications on realism when they were made. So although he didn't put his hands on them when he was making them, he conceived of them and held the work people to a very high level of craftsmanship in making these very kitschy objects. Robert Longo, who's from that same generation, he was first thought of as a neo-expressionist, but his work is actually more photorealist. Men in the Cities is a series he made in the 1980s that show these gawkish type movements, where they're somewhere in between ecstatic dancing and getting hammered. We're not sure, right? He doesn't let us know. But then he started working with some other imagery that was especially explosive. You can see the sun in the middle of this one over here. This was an incredible show, and I actually saw this show and I was like floored when I saw these works. I didn't know that he had it in him to create such realistic works. So they're all charcoal drawings. And the last work I have is from a younger artist, this time really young. He was born in the 1970s, and we have one of his works in our gallery right now. So Young Sung Kim is a Korean artist. He lives in Seoul, and he has a couple of galleries throughout the world, one in New York. And he's been working on this series. He was born in 73, but this is a current work, Nothing Life Object, and they all tend to be of small animals. In this case, like if they're fish, they're in water, but they could be snails or they could be frogs. And we get these extreme close-up images of these creatures. Nowadays, because of the technology, photorealists can do an even better job than they did in the past. Well, you can see one of Young Sung Kim's work in our gallery now, and it's the snail piece. And that was a little walk through photorealism, how it came to be, how it was related to past art, and what artists in the photorealist group were trying to do. Nowadays, as you can tell, there are lots of artists who work in this style. And that's all I have for you today. Next month I'll be no, what is it next month that I have I think we have a curators talk next month, and I know I have a talk on surrealism, which is I think in December. So the curators talk is going to go along with the new show that's going to be opening in our gallery, New Visions, which opens up in early to mid-November. Right?
Yep.
Everybody okay? Beth is back there in the background. She wants to say something. I want to thank you all for being there. And we're through for today. Beth, you got anything to say to sign off?
Oh, no. Thanks for joining us. And special thank you to the Patrick Medford Library.
Yay, we love the library. We love the library. I actually have loved libraries since I was about 7 years old, so I'm very happy to have a relationship with my local library. Very good. Well, thank you all. Have a great night.